My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kalimahorra on Al Mayadeen television. Mind you, I don't mince my words. I speak Kalimahorra, and my audience does too. Kalimahorra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to Kalimahorra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing a country that's no longer there, Yugoslavia. What role did NATO play in the bombardment of Yugoslavia and in the ending of a unitary Serbian state, in the birth of what at least part of the world calls Kosovo? Supporters of NATO describe it as a defensive organization, though the Libyan people might have something to say about that. And so, of course, do the people in Serbia. A defensive organization that got involved in a civil conflict in a country that had already begun to break up and, in fact, facilitated the illegal, unconstitutional transfer of a significant part of Serbia into some kind of, I don't know, purgatory, neither one thing nor the other, neither a state, at least not one recognized by the United Nations and much of the world, but recognized by all the familiar countries of the world. The ones who say that Crimea cannot have self-determination insist that Kosovo can. I've already made clear where I stand. I was one of the leading figures in the opposition in the British Parliament to NATO's role in the Yugoslav war. Under the leadership of the late Mr. Benn, there were only a dozen of us, but that can be a magic number. The role that NATO has played in recent conflicts has been so deleterious, we believe, that we formed No to NATO in London just the other month. It's growing like topsy. Many people are questioning now whether NATO is a good idea and whether its role in particular in the breakup of Yugoslavia was something worth supporting. President Clinton is, of course, no more. The Prime Minister, Tony Blair, who was the joint architect of NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia, is still very much with us. Indeed, he's considerably richer than he was back then. But these are only my personal views. This is called Kalimahorra for a reason. Everyone has a free word here, and I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. I'm joined, unusually, by a particularly expert panel of authoritative people, academics of the highest rank, which doesn't mean they're going to be right, of course. We'll soon find out. Let's meet the first of those. Dr. Aidan Heher is a reader in international relations at the University of Westminster. He's the author of several books, including, most apposite, Kosovo, Intervention and State Building, back in 2010. Dr. Aidan, tell us where I was wrong in my introduction there to this topic.
Hard to know where to begin. There's a lot there that I would disagree with. I don't think that NATO had a plan from the beginning to destroy Yugoslavia. I think its policies were very piecemeal, made on the hoof, and often they made mistakes. I don't think that NATO has ever presented itself as being a disinterested, charitable organisation.
It's a defensive alliance.
Yeah, but it has its own interests, clearly. And in Yugoslavia, at various different times, it had its interests and it pursued them. And sometimes I think the net effect of that was negative. I would say in the case of Kosovo that it had a very positive effect. And as much as I would present myself as somebody who would be highly critical of NATO, I wouldn't ever support unquestioningly US foreign policy or UK foreign policy. But in this specific case, I think the benefits of the intervention outweigh the negatives.
What would you say to those that say there's a highly selective approach to issues like Kosovo? For example, the Catalan question, who did make an effort to declare themselves independent from Spain, were crushed quite forcibly by the Spanish state with the full backing of the European Union. Or perhaps more contemporarily, the territory of Crimea. Why must that remain in a hostile Ukrainian state, but Kosovo must be allowed to be independent of an arguably hostile Serbian state?
I mean, I remember being in Switzerland in 1999, and there was lots of protests at the time by Kurds about what was happening in Turkey. And the response of NATO to what was happening in Turkey with respect to the Kurds differs significantly to what was happening with respect to the Kosovo Albanians. So if the charge is that NATO has been inconsistent, then I agree. Absolutely.
Well, inconsistent's a nice way of putting it. Hypocritical, double standards.
Yeah, you could say that.
A stronger way.
Standards. Yes, but I'm not aware of any state in the world that pursues a purely ethical foreign policy.
Just before I leave you then, what was the interest of NATO in facilitating further breakup of Yugoslavia?
I think there was a combination of factors. One of the bigger ones was that NATO wanted to expand. There was a sense that Eastern European countries were questioning, why would we join this organisation if it's not working, if it's moribund, if it can't deal with this crisis in Kosovo. And there was a sense that we need to project power into Eastern Europe to demonstrate that we still have a purpose. I also think that there was an economic rationale. Clinton said that at the time as well, that if we want to have a trade relationship with Europe, we can't have conflict on the borders of the EU, we need to deal with that. So there was very obviously self-interested motivations. But there was also a sense, I believe, amongst some people involved, that this couldn't be allowed to stand, that we had naked aggression being visited upon the Kosovo Albanians by the Serbian state, that Milosevic had demonstrated previously that he was intent on ridding Kosovo of the Albanian community, and that there was a strong moral case to be made there. It certainly wasn't the exclusive reason for intervening, but a degree of mixed motivation is inevitable in international relations.
Dr. Niall McRae, officer of the Workers of England Trade Union, former lecturer at King's College. Where did you stand, and where do you stand now looking back at what might be said to have been a prototype intervention by NATO? I certainly characterised it at the time. Mr. Benn taught us that if they succeed in this intervention in Yugoslavia, there will be a number of other countries down the line waiting for the same kind of treatment. And of course, that came to pass in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Syria. These all ineluctably flowing from the success, in inverted commas, of the NATO intervention in Yugoslavia.
Well, I think Balkanization was the purpose of NATO's intervention in Yugoslavia. Now, remember, after the fall of communism, Francis Fukuyama talked about the end of history. And what I believe he really meant was the end of politics. From now on, a neoliberal New World Order would prevail. And its first attack on nation state after the fall of communism, after Francis Fukuyama made that comment, was on Yugoslavia. And what we now see is a continuing dispute over Kosovo, which is a small area on the southern side of Serbia. And I believe that Kosovo is being used, has been used since the war in the late 90s, as a sort of bargaining chip Actually, it's worse than a bargaining chip. It's like an ultimatum. It's an ultimatum to the Serbian government that either you join us with the European project, with the values of NATO and the West, or we will take Kosovo from you, and we won't stop there. And we know from what happened in the war in the late 90s just how much the government in Belgrade was targeted. That country was destroyed by NATO. Perhaps Yugoslavia wouldn't have lasted anyway after the fall of communism. We don't know that, but it certainly wouldn't have ended in the way that it did, which was a carnage. NATO spent 78 days bombing Serbia. It wasn't just bombing the Zastava ammunition factory. It was bombing care homes, hospitals, the
TV
power
stations,
grid,
like
TV
this one.
stations. Yeah.
Chinese embassy.
So you were primed for it, George, coming from your end of the political spectrum. Yugoslavia was the first time, for me coming from a more sort of conservative point of view, it's the first time I realized just how bad the West and NATO actually are.
Dr. Jakub Azemi, journalist and postgraduate teaching assistant at the UCL in London, School of Slavonic and East European Studies. Dr. Aidan thought there was no plan. Dr. Nile thinks there was a plan. I also do. Where do you stand?
Well, a lot to talk about the way how you frame the question. But I think if you want to attack NATO's moral dimension, I think choosing to attack it over Kosovo is I think, a wrong framework. When we talk about NATO's involvement in NATO, in Kosovo, we forget actually the history of Yugoslavia, of dissolution of last Yugoslavia, the political balance that existed before Serbia encroached on the autonomy of Kosovo, which was all but in name as a republic of former Yugoslavia, 8 constitutive elements of federal Yugoslavia, on which Serbia embarked, removed its autonomy, and sort of destroyed the balance upon which the Yugoslav Federation rested. Following that, Albanians responded peacefully for 10 years. They organized a non-violent movement, avoiding to enter in a conflict which would have had catastrophic consequences for the whole region. The Western powers, the EU, the United States, Russia, you might review their approach towards the Yugoslav crisis, and you might then attack the West. Why not having intervened earlier in Bosnia and prevent the massacres of civilian population there? But when it came to the Kosovo crisis, the Milosevic regime, Serbian regime, would not stop. Their ultimate aim was to wipe Kosovo from Albanians' substance. It is then when the West and the NATO decided enough was enough. Then you may decide to criticize NATO from different perspectives, but as far as Kosovo is concerned, I think it is one of the. If we actually want to study politics from an ethical point of view, it is there where you might find the ethics in international politics. It saved 2 million population. It caused damage. It bombarded 78 days in Serbia, but it was necessary.
Necessary, I see. Dear Doctor, I was in Kosovo when almost nobody in Britain knew whether it was something you ate, drank, or drove. So I'm not in need of any lectures about Kosovo and Milosevic and Serbia. I'm a former president of the Great Britain Albania Society, in which capacity I was there in Pristina. But to say that, and I oppose the ending of the status of Kosovo within Serbia, but to say it was in everything but name a republic of Yugoslavia is simply untrue.
It was.
It was a province of Serbia, which was a constituent part of Yugoslavia.
Can I take you on this? Yes. In 1912 and 13, when the Balkanic Wars, with the withdrawal of the Ottoman Empire from the Balkan regions, Kosovo was not part of Serbia. Serbia occupied Kosovo, and in terms of international legal instruments, Kosovo was
at exactly the same time. Kuwait was a part of Iraq.
Kosovo,
how many walayats are we going to
Mr.
argue
Galloway,
about here?
If you allow me to, Kosovo was never incorporated within Serbia in terms of international legal instruments. For that to happen, the Assembly of Serbia and Assembly of Turkey at the time should have ratified an agreement for that to happen. That never happened. Kosovo was incorporated as part of Yugoslavia at the time, Kingdom of Yugoslavia, between among Serbia, Slovenia, and Croatia, but never part of Serbia. Similarly, during the Second World War, Kosovo was incorporated partly within Serbia, and then gradually its status was advanced. Hence, in 1974, Kosovo became a constitutive element of the Yugoslav Federation, along with Vojvodina and 6 other republics. Serbia could not have changed its constitution without the consent of Kosovo and Vojvodina. It did so without their consent, bullying them with the military, with police and paramilitary forces, forcing Kosovo, and including pushing different entities to occupy the parliament of Kosovo and with the acclamation, change the constitution of Kosovo. Following that, Albanians, as I just said, for 10 years responded peacefully. 10 years through a parallel.
Was the KLA a peaceful organization?
KLA was you cannot qualify a military organization peaceful, but KLA only appeared after the Dayton Agreement, which failed to incorporate Kosovo in its.
Did it come from thin air? The Kosovo Liberation Army.
Kosovo Liberation Army grew from small groups from 3-4 individuals in Kosovo. Gradually grew in 1997, 98. Because at that time there was no other way. But
supported by the CIA, wasn't it?
Rather mysterious, the emergence from 3 or 4 people to the organization it later came to be. But let's get a view from Budapest in Hungary to talk to Professor George Samuli, who's a senior research fellow at the Global Policy Institute and author of, again, Apposite, Bombs for Peace, NATO's humanitarian war in Yugoslavia. Professor George, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Dr. George, why did NATO bomb Yugoslavia in 1999, and was that legitimate?
I certainly don't think it was legitimate. I think NATO wanted to show its relevance. Less than a decade had passed since the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and the emerging consensus within the Western world was that now that the Warsaw Pact is dissolved, there was very little sense in NATO to continuing to exist. And so NATO invented a idea for itself, which is the responsibility to protect. So it manufactured a pretext that it was stepping in with bombs in order to save the Kosovo Albanians from the marauding Serbs. It was completely untrue. So that's one reason. The second reason, I think, is that NATO saw the Serbs as a proxy for Russia. They wanted to eliminate Russian influence from Europe once and for all. The Balkans, particularly the Serbs, had been very close to the Russians, and they saw that this is one golden opportunity, essentially, to push Russia and Russian influence out once and for all.
The UN Charter prohibits the member states from attacking other member states without the endorsement of the Security Council. So why did they do it?
Well, that's exactly right, that they knew that they would not be able to get the United Nations Security Council to approve of this bombing. And they made no effort, in fact, to go to the Security Council to get the mandate, because they knew that Russia would, of course, veto it, as would China. And this was really the first of the numerous Western military interventions that came without any kind of a mandate from the UN Security Council.
Why did the UN do nothing about the NATO action? Kofi Annan danced around its legitimacy, legality, and the rest. And did it mean from that day onwards that NATO could strike member states of the UN without the authority of the UN?
Well, can they do it? Are they physically able to do it? Yes, because the United States, United Kingdom, France, who are all signed up for this, they're all chartered members of NATO, they're all nuclear powers, and they can do it. And they can essentially present Russia, who was very opposed to this, with a fait accompli and say to them, well, what are you going to do about it? We know Serbia is your friend, but there's nothing you can do, because are you going to start a nuclear war for Serbia? And of course, Russia said, no, we're not. But going back to Kofi Annan was very evasive. He suggested that it was illegal, but it was legitimate. So he kind of went very close to the edge. Because he ultimately had to say that you can't use force without some kind of an imprimatur from the Security Council. But he said, yeah, but it was legitimate because it had some humanitarian goal behind it.
It sounds like sophistry, but what was argued at the time was that the Charter forbids individual member states of the UN from attacking other member states, but NATO is not a state, although it could argue it's rapidly becoming one.
No, of course not. NATO is supposed to be a military alliance, but the strange thing is that NATO has now acquired this nebulous continental entity whereby NATO seems to be like a country. So you have President Biden talking about, we are going to defend every inch of NATO territory. Well, since when did NATO have any kind of territory? NATO is supposed to be a military alliance. It doesn't have territory, but it's now acquired the standing that, well, NATO keeps expanding, and so this territory becomes NATO land, a state run by NATO. And in effect, something like that is emerging, which of course is a violation of the NATO Charter.
What lessons should we draw from the NATO action in Yugoslavia in 1999?
Well, the lesson that I would draw is that NATO should have dissolved at the end of the Cold War, that NATO, as it continues to exist and as it continues to expand, is a threat to world peace. It's a threat to every country in its neighborhood. And as long as NATO is in existence, and as long as it will continue to expand, and as it continues to expand, it is going to come into conflict with more and more countries. What happened to Yugoslavia was the first of NATO's wars, and which also came about as a result of its will to expansion, because NATO saw the Serbs as, as I said, close to Russia, not exactly friendly toward NATO, and therefore they had to be eliminated. So my feeling is that there can be no peace, security, and kind of a mutual cooperation among nations as long as NATO continues to exist. The only thing that makes sense is to work out some kind of a security framework, so initially certainly in Europe, Eurasia, that accommodates everybody's security interests, not just the 30 countries that comprise NATO membership.
Heated debate, and it'll get even hotter in the second half. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalimahora with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming from London, talking about a country long gone, Yugoslavia. Dr. Aidan, just before the break, our professor in Budapest reminded us of what we might call the Chicago Doctrine, developed by Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, in which big powers arrogated to themselves the right to protect other people. Isn't that exactly what Russia's doing in Ukraine?
No.
Aren't they protecting the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine?
Look, the previous speaker alleged that it was to do with the responsibility to protect in 1999. That didn't even exist until 2001. It wasn't even recognized.
No, it was theorized. But it was theorized.
The idea of humanitarian intervention goes back thousands of years. The responsibility to protect is an idea that came about 2 years after.
No, that was merely theorizing.
No,
practicality was in '99.
No, that was a different.
Theorized.
Responsibility to protect is not the same thing as humanitarian intervention. They're two distinct things.
Tell me the difference.
The difference is humanitarian intervention is an action taken in response to atrocity crimes inside another state. The responsibility
without international
potentially without the consent of the Security Council or the consent of the host state. The responsibility to protect.
Give me an example of that.
Well, Kosovo in 1999.
No, before that.
Of a humanitarian intervention.
Who invaded another country prior to the invasion of Yugoslavia on a humanitarian mission without the authority of the Security Council?
Well, Tanzania got involved in Uganda, India got involved in East Pakistan, Cambodia intervened in Vietnam. You can go back previously. There's lots of examples of that happening, even in just the post-UN era. But I really think it's important to come back to the basic facts here. And the facts of this aren't necessarily, did NATO do something because it was purely impelled by moral reasons? If that's your threshold for a humanitarian intervention, then that clearly didn't happen in 1999. I'm not dewy-eyed about Tony Blair's motivations or the Chicago speech that he gave in April 1999. They have interests. NATO has interests. That's not a revelation. But to attribute the intervention in Kosovo to some master plan and to make out that because the people who intervened in Kosovo in 1999 were relatively the same people who intervened in Iraq in 2003 means that 1999 has to be seen as absolutely the same project is ridiculous. The notion that NATO destroyed Yugoslavia, it's a complete fallacy. Yugoslavia was destroyed by Serbian nationalists. That's who destroyed Yugoslavia.
Let me give you an example of how there might have been a plan. In Bush House, it's probably a block of luxury flats now, but there used to be the BBC World Service. It had a radio station for every one of the constituent parts of Yugoslavia, beaming nationalist and separatist propaganda into those countries, paid for by the Foreign Office in Britain. That sounds like a plan to me.
Okay, fine. So the UK is involved in projecting its interests overseas and is in supporting particular groups. Fine, but that doesn't mean that the group itself is fundamentally illegitimate. The Kosovo Liberation Army, as was mentioned, emerged after 1995, after the Dayton Accords, which was the imposition of an agreement on the former Yugoslavia by the West, which they hoped would end any further cessationism. For the Kosovo Albanians, that was a disaster. The idea that they had this plan to separate Kosovo and Serbia doesn't equate with 1995. After 1995, the West said, Milosevic is the hard man in the Balkans, we can deal with him, he's going to maintain stability. We want nothing to do with Kosovo, right up until 1998. In 1998, Robert Gelbart, who was the US ambassador to Yugoslavia, he described the Kosovo Liberation Army as a terrorist organization. So even at that point, in 1998, the West's approach to what was the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia at that point was, keep it as it is. We don't want any more cessationism, and to hell with the Kosovo Albanians. Now, as Milosevic's policies accelerated, that became untenable. But the notion that in 1991, somebody sat down in the bowels of the White House and said, let's dismember Yugoslavia, it's ridiculous.
Well, is it, Niall? A terrorist organization, the KLA, as quoted by, we became its air force. How did that happen? How did the KLA go from 3 or 4 people to being described as a terrorist organization and then become the beneficiary of the NATO Air Force?
Well, this neoliberal stroke neocon project of NATO and the EU is quite happy to use violent extremists for its cause. I believe that the Kosovan Liberation Army has got elements of fascism in the same way that the Azov Battalion does in Ukraine. But the EU and NATO will use these groups. They will use them because they're violent, because they're extreme, because that is how they get the best result. That is what they believe. They believe people fear violence, which they do. People feared the Azov Battalion in Ukraine, just as the many Serbian people who live in Kosovo feared the Kosovan Liberation Army.
Let's get a view from Belgrade. Dr. Helena, welcome to you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Dr. Helena, in your analysis of the role of propaganda in the events of 1999, what did you find?
I basically found out that propaganda played a very important role in motivating violence against civilians, or at the very least, increasing support for regimes that were advocating such violence. In the Yugoslav case in particular, we basically had a country that used to peacefully coexist for decades that all of a sudden violently fell apart within, basically 10 years. And the main role that I believe propaganda played is that it created these discourses of threat, which basically portrayed the other side as threatening, thereby justifying the violence that were committed by the various troops.
Can you elaborate more on the role of NATO or members of NATO in that propaganda campaign?
Yeah, well, I think, politically speaking, NATO has played a really important role in the region, right? Like we've basically seen, NATO conduct an aerial campaign in the former Yugoslavia because of the violence that was happening in Kosovo during 1998, 1999. So clearly, politically speaking, NATO was really important back in the 90s. I would argue that even today, NATO continues to play a very important role in Kosovo. I think, whenever we see a flare up in Kosovo, people are concerned, are we going to see another war in Kosovo? And every time someone asks me that question, I always tell them that because KFOR troops are there, we're not going to see a war. The fact that NATO troops are based in Kosovo plays a really important role in preventing escalation and also, serving as a deterrent factor for both sides, Serb and Kosovo alike, not to over-escalate. So politically speaking, NATO is a really important factor in keeping and maintaining peace in the region.
So in your findings, was there justification for NATO taking the action it did in the absence of a Security Council resolution?
Well, NATO was never going to get the United Nations Security Council mandate, right? Because both Russia and China were quite clear that any such intervention would be vetoed, and China and Russia, as the P5 members, basically do have the power to do so. So if NATO was to wait for the approval of the United Nations Security Council, the campaign would have never happened. I think that is probably the first controversy surrounding that intervention, that technically speaking, it wasn't legal. There were some, other controversies surrounding the intervention. For instance, in April 1999, NATO bombed the headquarters of the Radio and Television of Serbia, which is probably the first time in contemporary history that a media organization has been deemed a legitimate target, right? But NATO's justification was basically that some military infrastructure was based in this building, but also that propaganda by RTS was so harmful and so important in the process of encouraging violence that basically made RTS a legitimate target. I think all of that means that, the discourses surrounding NATO in Serbia are very, very, very negative. At the same time, however, if NATO didn't do anything, there is a real question as to what this region would have looked like and what kind of things would have happened. Go back to 1995, for example, in Srebrenica, when, the appetite for intervening was not as high as it was in 1999. And we basically have a situation whereby the international community stood by and watched genocide happen in Srebrenica. So, from NATO's point of view, back at the time, there was a serious concern that violence in Kosovo might escalate past the point of no return, and that it is much better to intervene and prevent such violence rather than sit back and do nothing, given that there was a clarity that United Nations Security Council approval was never really going to come through.
It was a new departure for NATO in 1999, attacking member state of the United Nations, which had not attacked another member state. It was a sign of things to come, wasn't it?
Well, I definitely think that, humanitarian interventions are a thing. We have seen humanitarian interventions in the past. And, I do think that whenever there is a substantial concern that if nothing is done, serious violence against civilians will occur, we can potentially expect to have a humanitarian intervention. I mean, if we ever do see a NATO member country attacked, we can expect NATO to respond. In terms of all other cases, I think it's going to be a case-to-case decision making, whereby if there is a consensus among NATO member states, we can expect NATO to do something. But if such consensus cannot be reached, then potentially we're not going to see any form of intervention. I think it's really going to be a case-to-case assessment as to what NATO does in these instances.
You're a citizen of Serbia living in Belgrade. What do people feel there now, these years on? Are they happy about the NATO intervention or the opposite?
Well, I really think that depends who do you ask. So if you ask people from Kosovo, I am sure that they are very happy and supportive of the fact that the intervention has happened. If you ask people from Serbia, and if you look at the data from the research that's been conducted on the issue in Serbia, people are very frustrated by that. For them, NATO intervention is unforgivable. People in Serbia feel that they have been attacked by a foreign international organization for no legitimate reasons. So yeah, it is a very polarizing thing. It really depends which ethnicity / which country you live in. Basically, that's what's going to impact your opinion on NATO. If you live in a country or if you belong to the ethnicity that has been supported by NATO, then most surely you will be very supportive of the intervention. However, if you don't, then very clearly this intervention will be seen as an unforgivable act on behalf of NATO. So it really depends.
Dr. Jakub, Dr. Aden was aghast at my comparison with the plight of the people in the Donbass, who for 8 years were bombarded by the Kiev regime, 14,000 of them killed. Isn't the Russian intervention to protect them merely RTP, the right to protect?
There is no enough evidence, in my view, that Ukrainians started to discriminate or attack people of Donbass. People of Donbass have suffered.
The OSCE record
have suffered.
You can read it.
People of Donbass or Russian population in Ukraine have suffered as a consequence of Russian being Russian proxy within Ukraine and being found in.
But that's your opinion. I have another opinion. But the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, has voluminous evidence that is exactly what happened.
You're talking about the same OSCE and the same and the Council of Europe's protagonist entities such as Dick Marty, who were used by Serbian and Russian sort of propaganda to produce these reports against KLA and Abolit. These are politicized.
Highly selective. You're highly selective.
Politicized reports.
This is all very highly selective. The OSCE is right here, but not there. The right to protect exists here, but not there. Isn't this the chaos of the so-called rules-based international order, as opposed to international law as expressed through the Charter of the United Nations?
Let me counter pose you a question. Was that necessary for Russia to invade Ukraine? Did that give a legitimate right for Russia to invade Ukraine?
Well, you say it gave NATO the right to invade Serbia.
Donbass region and all these, they never had the status that Kosovo had. So again, Kosovo is in.
If the right to protect is a humanitarian one, that when civilians are being bombarded and killed, that a big power nearby, in the case of NATO, not so nearby, has the right to intervene to protect them. Why does that right exist for Kosovans but not for the people of eastern Ukraine?
Then you would would rightly ask a question, why don't we empower the United Nations with the military power and choose where to intervene?
Well, if my aunt had a beard, she'd be my uncle. The reality is that Russia has intervened in eastern Ukraine to protect the people of eastern Ukraine from 8 years of bombardment. You condemn it, and yet commend the NATO intervention against Serbia on exactly the same grounds you're rejecting in Ukraine.
But Mr. Galloway, the conflict in Donbass didn't start. It started in 2014 for completely different reasons.
I'm not talking about the reason, I'm talking about the effect.
The effect.
The cause, what about the effect?
It's sorry, I mean, I have to say, there is no way you can draw a comparison.
No, I know that you don't want to.
No,
I'm asking you intellectually.
Objectively, there's no way. You present them as analogous. They're absolutely not in any way analogous. Ukraine is a sovereign state. Russia is a sovereign state. Russia annexes Crimea in 2014 and invades eastern Ukraine. And in the process of that conflict, Ukraine responds, Russia responds, and there is a conflict in that particular region. The nature of that conflict is completely different. The state-sponsored oppression that the Serbian forces initiated without any justification in Kosovo from 1989 onwards. When Milosevic rescinds Kosovo's autonomous province status, completely against the constitution of Yugoslavia, he initiates this whole process. The people of Kosovo then try to peacefully resist Serbian oppression and are eventually brought to the horrible conundrum where they have to take up arms against the Serbs. That is a completely different situation to Russia invading Crimea in 2014.
I wish you would take a walk through the areas that have been bombarded for 8 years by the regime in Kiev and explain to the parents of the children lost there that their children were children of a lesser God, that they did not meet your test of RTP, but the children of Kosovo did. It's a remarkable double standard.
It isn't at all. It isn't at all. Obviously, any death is a tragedy, and I have nothing but sympathy for people who've been caught up in this particular war.
But they have no right to protection.
When you look at who caused the conflict in eastern Ukraine, it is Russia.
Even if that was true, which it isn't, even if that was true, are the children of a lesser God in the Donbass?
Of course they're not.
So who's going to protect them?
Who caused that problem?
Never mind who caused it. It's Ukrainians that were killing them with NATO weapons, the same NATO that you're supporting in Yugoslavia.
No, I'm not denying that there has been crimes committed by Ukrainian forces against innocent Russians. That's not something that we're going to disagree about. The point that I do disagree about is that you're suggesting that the situation in Kosovo in 1999 is the same as the situation that Russia faced in 2014.
I can see why you're uncomfortable with it. Dr. Nile, the long and the short of it is that it was a success. Kosovo is now effectively an independent state, recognized by all but 2, I think, of the members of NATO. Not recognized by the majority of the world, but then that's the world we've got now. There's an us and them. It destroyed Yugoslavia, which ceased to exist shortly afterwards, the final breakup between Serbia and Montenegro, leaving Serbia alone. And now the government in Belgrade is being strong-armed into accepting and recognizing what is effectively a NATO protectorate in Kosovo. I'm arguing that in every one of those particulars, this was a template of what came later. As we predicted at the time that it would be. The success of the NATO operation in Yugoslavia directly led to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and the attempt in Syria. Am I wrong or right?
Well, I think it's interesting that there's been a lot of talk comparing Kosovo with the Donbass and the double standards that appear. Because the professor on the Danube who spoke to us earlier, his argument was that the Serbians were used as a proxy for the Russians. There's a deep hatred of Russia in the neoliberal, neocon establishment. There has been for decades. It didn't go away with the fall of communism. In fact, arguably, it's got worse over the last 20 years or so. But it's a very interesting point that he made, because it shows that we're actually talking about the same thing. This is not about humanitarian ethics. This is an attack on people that won't go along with the Western way, that won't go along with NATO. And if you listen to the ordinary Serbian people, they're at odds with the globalist-infused government and institutions in Belgrade, which the likes of the Tony Blair Institute have been promoting. The ordinary Serbian people, I'm sure they want peace for themselves and the Kosovans and for their other neighbours. But they have strong bonds with Russia. They revere what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary, fighting back against the imposition of these supposedly progressive liberal values of the West and NATO, but actually they're totalitarian values. Serbian people should be able to live as they want to live, just as the people in the Donbass should be able to live the way they want to live, and the Hungarian people should be able to live the way they want to live. There is a growing gap between the governments of these countries across Europe and the ordinary people. And I'll tell you what, George, you're picking this up with your No to NATO organization that you're involved in, is that there's a growing resentment of this war being fought, not in my name, not in your name, and not in an increasing number of people in this country's name.
If you think Tony Blair acted out of humanitarian motives in Yugoslavia or anywhere in his miserable life, I've got a bridge here in London I could sell you going cheap. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalamahora. Thanks for watching.